In today's video, you're going to learn everything you need to know regarding Promise.any within JavaScript, not to be confused with Promise.all, all settled, or Promise.race. However, we will discuss the differences between all of these methods. All right, so we're going to start with kind of a conceptual explanation of how Promise.any works. Then we'll get into some examples so it becomes more clear how it works. And then we'll discuss some specifics on how it's different than some of the other promise methods like all settled, and race. So moving back up to how this method works. So this method, it takes an array of promises. And what it's going to do is it's going to return the first fulfilled promise within that array. So you pass it an array of promises and it returns the first fulfilled promise. Now it will ignore any rejected promise. So even if a promise rejects, it will just kind of ignore that and will return the first promise that actually resolves successfully. So this method is useful for returning the first promise that fulfills, but it will short circuit after that promise fulfills, and it will not wait for other promises to finish. And it will also just ignore promises that reject and will just continue to wait for the first promise that successfully resolves and return the value of that promise without waiting for any other promises to resolve. All right, so let's look at some examples of how this works here. So in my code here on line 18, I just create a promise that rejects with the value of 0 using the promise.reject method. And then on line 19, I create another promise, and I have this promise that resolves after 100 milliseconds. And then on line 21, I have another promise that resolves, but that will resolve after 500 milliseconds. So the first thing that's going to happen is promise 1 is going to reject, then promise 2 is going to resolve, and then promise 3 is going to resolve. And then I put all of these promises within an array here on line 24. So I put promise 1, 2, and 3 within this array. And then I use the promise object. So an object that you get for free within your programs, you do not need to create this anywhere. You can use this object for free. And then I access the .any method, and I pass in my array of promises. And then to handle the return value of the .any method, I use a .then function because the .any method is going to return a promise of the first value that resolves within my array of promises. So I can chain on a .then, and I just console log the value that resolves. And then I also, if something rejects, I'll just console log rejected. So if I run my code here, what you're going to see is I get quick, because in my array of promises here, the first promise that successfully fulfills is going to be the promise with the value of quick, because it's going to ignore this rejected promise right here. And then the promise with the value of slow, well, that's not going to run until after 500 milliseconds. So that's going to resolve after promise 2 here. And the promise.any method is going to return the first successfully fulfilled promise. And as you will see, if I change this to be 800 milliseconds for promise 2, and then I run this, you're going to see that I get slow console logged out, because now promise 3 is going to fulfill after 500 milliseconds with the value of slow, but it's going to short circuit and return the value of that promise. And we aren't actually going to handle promise 2 because it's going to resolve after. Okay, so the promise.any method within JavaScript, it takes an array of promises and it will return the first successfully fulfilled promise, but it will ignore any rejected promises. And once it returns the first successfully fulfilled promise, it will kind of short circuit and it won't continue to wait for any other promises to resolve. And since it returns a promise, you can handle it with the .then method. Now, how is this different than the promise.all, promise.all settled, and promise.race methods? Well, promise.all, this is going to actually return an array of fulfilled values. But in promise.any, we only get one fulfilled value. So promise.all, it's not going to short circuit these values, and it's going to return all the fulfilled values. So let's take a look at how this works. And let me actually resolve promise 1 here, because that's going to make sure that this works properly. And if I change this to promise.all, what you're going to see is that we actually get an array of all of the fulfilled values. so it doesn't short circuit and just return one value. Now, promise.all settled, it's very similar to promise.all. It returns an array, but it's going to return an array of all of the settled promises, regardless of whether they reject or they fulfill. So in my example here, if I reject this promise and I run my code, you're going to see that I console logged rejected. I no longer get an array of these fulfilled promises here because my promise array had a rejected promise in it. So that's going to reject all of them, and it's just going to go into my .catch method. So with promise.all, if you have a rejection, it doesn't return the fulfilled values. But if I use promise.all settled here, it will return a array of all the fulfilled values. So here you can see that I get an array of objects. So that's another kind of difference there. It gives you an array of objects. And then I get the status, whether it is rejected or fulfilled. And then I either get, if it's rejected, I will get a reason for it. And in this case, my reason doesn't make sense because I just reject it with a value of 0. But you might imagine that this would be a string describing the reason of some error here. And then if I run this again, you're going to see I do indeed get a reason as some error, but I still get the fulfilled values within my return value here. So promise.all settled, it's going to return an array of objects kind of describing all of the values, even if a value rejects. Now, promise.race here, which I think is very similar to promise.any, it's going to return the first value, whether it is a rejected value or a fulfilled value. But promise.any, it's only going to return the first value that fulfills successfully. So if we look at this, we see that I get rejected because that is my first promise that kind of fulfills here. And I can change this to resolve, and we're still going to see the same output because I'm not waiting at all to resolve this promise. So that's going to be the first one that returns. But if I comment this out and I delete this, you're going to see that the first promise that resolves here is going to be my one with 500 milliseconds compared to one with 800. So if I run this, it's going to return slow because that is my first promise that fulfills here. And the difference between promise.race and promise.any is that promise.race is going to return the first promise that either resolves or rejects, to where promise.any, it's only going to return the first promise that resolves successfully. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a good idea of how promise.any works and the differences between promise.all, all settled, and race. Stay tuned for future videos to where I hit a little bit more in depth on promise.all, all settled, and promise.race, as well as more asynchronous things in JavaScript. So thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you in that next one.